Our presentation is about reintegrative shaming, and my name is Madison Johnson.
My name is Paige Sidney.
My name's Kevin Gonzalez.
And I'm Addison Lake.
So the prompt for our project was to explain Braithwaite's reintegrative shaming concept and to give examples of how it works in practice.
And looking at reintegrative shaming, we'll be drawing on three key examples. First, Japan, where cultural values of shame and honor are deeply tied to community, showing how public disapproval can deter crime while also supporting reintegration. Second, New Zealand's family group conferencing, which brings together offenders, victims, and families to address harm collectively, highlighting how restorative justice practices can repair relationships rather than isolate offenders. And finally, the case of Sean Mentra, where the court requires him to wear a sign acknowledging his crime, raising questions about whether the punishment was reintegrative or stigmatizing. Together, these examples show the range of how reintegrative shaming can work in practice, from cultural traditions to formal justice systems.
So before we talk about reintegrative shaming, we think we should explain what labeling theory is, because reintegrative shaming is a subtheory within labeling theory. So labeling theory concentrates on socialization and believes that the social control agents of society create criminal behavior through overreactions to minor rule breaking. These agents include both informal and formal groups such as teachers, police officers, parents, and other significant groups in power. And labeling theorists assert that the negative socialization, which results from society's reaction, negatively affects people's self-esteem and self-identity. And this results in criminal behavior through the internalization of the judgment. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and this socialization could include negative labels, bullying, exclusion, name calling, and other forms of negative stereotyping that leads to the person becoming the deviant individual that the labels projected, which leads to crime. And two early labeling theorists are Howard Beckert and Edward M. Lemert, and they believe that people's personal identity is developed through actively engaging and communicating with others, and that this social interaction is important in predicting criminal behavior. And the picture we have here shows the concept of primary and secondary deviance, which is a process of labeling theory that was developed by Lemert. And this process begins with primary deviance, which includes minor rule breaking that doesn't really have any consequence for the person's social identity, and that's provided that they have a strong self image to begin with. And this is followed by secondary deviance, which is behavior that results after the reaction and labels are produced by the authorities in response to the primary deviance. And this behavior stems from the person's self identity while they're dealing with the labels from primary deviance. And it's necessary to understand the concept of labeling theory as a whole before we explain the concept of reintegrative shaming, because many of the core ideas of reintegrative shaming build and expand upon that of labeling theory and all the concepts we just discussed.
Now that we've covered the basics of labeling theory, we wanted to turn to the history of reintegrative shaming and how the idea was developed. The concept was created by John Braithwaite. He was an Australian criminologist. Early in his career, Braithwaite studied white-collar crime in the pharmaceutical industry. His research led him to think about not just why people offend, but also about what happens after they've been labeled as criminals. Braithwaite was strongly influenced by the work of Irving Goffman, who is a social psychologist, and he wrote about the damaging consequences of stigma. Goffman explained that stigma often leads to social isolation, discrimination, and a loss of self-esteem. When a person is branded with a deviant label, others may reject them, employers may refuse to hire them, landlords may not rent to them, and even family or friends may distance themselves. This kind of treatment can make it extremely difficult for someone to move forward with their life, even after they have served their punishment. Building on these ideas, Braithwaite introduced the term disintegrative shaming. This refers to a kind of shaming that does not just criticize a harmful act, but goes further by condemning the person themselves. Instead of sending the message, what you did was wrong, disintegrative shaming says, you are wrong, you are a criminal, you are an outsider. The goal is to stigmatize and exclude. For example, when people leave prison, they often find that their criminal record continues to define them. They face limited opportunities for employment, housing, and even social relationships. Braithwaite argued that this permanent stigma traps people in cycles of disadvantage, which in turn makes them more likely to reoffend, which is a pattern known as recidivism. To address this problem, Braithwaite developed the idea of reintegrative shaming. Unlike disintegrative shaming, this approach condemns the behavior but not the person. The message becomes, what you did was harmful, but you're still a member of our community and you have the potential to do better. In other words, the wrongdoing is rejected, but the individual is not cast out forever.
So previously, like discussed, just to rehash it a little bit, John Braithwaite, he introduced reintegrative shaming so that it's more of a positive and constructive approach compared to disintegrative shaming. Um, Also, like Paige said, it's more of like what you did was wrong, but you're not the bad person. This distinction matters because labeling someone as a criminal or deviant often traps them in that identity, making them more likely to reoffend. But when the shame is directed only at the act, it leaves room for the offender to change and come back into the community. This model works by reassuring offenders that they're still morally good individuals while also holding them accountable. Communities or justice systems provide mechanisms like apology, reinstitution, or community service that help the offender repair the harm. Once that process is complete, the person is welcomed back rather than excluded. For example, instead of branding a young person as a thief, reintegrative shaming might involve them apologizing to the store owner and repaying the loss and then being told you made a mistake, but we believe that you can do better. Importantly, reintegrative shaming also rejects the use of negative stereotypes and stigmas. It does not label the offender permanently or define them only by their crime. Instead, it emphasizes forgiveness, responsibility, and repair. This approach explains why some societies with strong community ties and practice of reinstallation often report lower crime rates. They have systems in place that balance accountability within reintegration, which ultimately discourages repeat offending and strengthens trust among people. So overall, Braithwaite's reintegration shaming is not just about punishing crime, it's about condemning the harmful act while keeping the door open for change for that person. It creates a pathway for offenders to take responsibility, make amends, and rejoin society rather than being permanently marked as outsiders. This balance of accountability and acceptance is what makes reintegrative shaming such an important idea in criminology and restorative justice.
By now, you've heard the definition of reintegrative shaming and how it prevents crime through focusing on the behavior and not the person. These methods are done with the intentions of bringing the offender back into society. An example of this would be countries that have implemented reintegration programs, such as New Zealand and Japan. For Japan, their culture favors respect and forgiveness, which is why reintegration is an important part of their court system. Depending on the crime, the offender will get reintegrated back into society with light punishment, such as public service. New Zealand's Family Group Conferencing, FGC, which is grounded in the theory that Dr. John Braithwaite created, puts emphasis on the morale of family and community. This process was set up for kid offenders, where this FGC conference includes the offender, victim, and professional caregivers. A lawyer and representative from the police department are provided. The expectation is that both parties come to consensus on the outcome of the case and how to prevent future criminal developments from transpiring. Now, for the perspective of someone who actually went through the reintegrated process, we can look towards Sean Gimtra, who in 2001 stole letters from several mailboxes in San Francisco. The policy for mail theft under California law was 2 months imprisonment, followed by 3 years supervised release. While he still got 2 months imprisonment, Sean's supervised release was modified. Instead, he was sentenced to spending 48-hour days in the post office, inquiring about lost or stolen items, writing letters of apology to the victims of the crime, and delivering lectures to San Francisco high schools, explaining how crime affects people. While reintegrative shaming doesn't get rid of the punishment altogether, it helps the offender to revisit their crime, but instead the perspective that they give back to the community. And these are our works cited, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Thanks.